This is your before and after story. Prepare for an incredible career in nursing. At Southeastern College, experience expert hands-on training. Learn real-world skills in our professional lab and simulated settings. And train for opportunities as a practical nurse, registered nurse, or career advancement with our RN to BSN program. At Southeastern College, your future is bright. Visit sac.edu to get started.
Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to retired U.S. Army Special Forces Colonel Stu Bradin, the president and CEO of the Global SOF Foundation. He takes us inside the upcoming Indo-Pacific Irregular Warfare Symposium, which the Global SOF Foundation will be holding in Bangkok, Thailand, starting on August 19th, 2025. We also discuss the Trump-Putin summit on the Ukraine war. We'll dive into new details about President Trump's push for a Golden Dome next-generation missile defense shield, and national security reporter Vaughn Cockayne will tell us about the surge of Chinese icebreaker activity in the Arctic, and much more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor here at the Washington Times, and we're doing things a little differently with this episode as our regular host, National Security Correspondent Ben Wolfgang, is away this week. The good news is that I've tapped reporter Vaughn Cockayne, a real rising star on the Threat Status team, to join me this week. Vaughn's reporting on geopolitics, the State Department, the defense industrial space, and more is featured really every week in the Threat Status newsletter in some way or another. And frankly, I'm proud of him, and we're lucky that he's here. Vaughn, without further ado, what's on your radar?
Thanks, Guy. Great to be here for the first time. It's an honor and a pleasure. From the jump, we have new reporting uncovering details on the Pentagon's plans for President Trump's Golden Dome missile defense shield. As I reported earlier this week, according to a Reuters report from Tuesday, Pentagon officials fed new details on next-generation missile defense system via a slideshow to some 3,000 contractors who attended an exclusive meeting at the tail end of the Space and Missile Defense Symposium last week in Huntsville, Alabama. The slideshow, reportedly titled Go Fast, Think Big, revealed that Golden Dome would rely on a 4-layered defense structure comprised of space and land-based systems, including interceptors, radar systems, and even lasers. Additionally, the slides include details on new missile defense fields that would support the U.S.'s ground-based mid-course defense radar network. The site, which the slides say could be located somewhere in the Midwest, would be the third GMD site after California and Alaska. Now, the Pentagon has thus far refused to publicly acknowledge the new details and maintains that Golden Dome is still in the early stages of development. But the report marks the first real string of details revealed about the program since President Trump gave us the 3-year timeline back in May. Guy, I know you were down in Huntsville last week and saw firsthand defense officials refuse to discuss Golden Dome details with reporters. And you mentioned during last week's show that security concerns are likely at the top of the Pentagon's mind. Going forward, do you think the Pentagon might be even more tight-lipped about Golden Dome?
It's a great question, Vaughn. I kind of go back and forth on this, and I don't necessarily think that anything specific was revealed during this meeting between top defense officials and defense industry private contractors that went on in Huntsville a week ago. This 4-layer approach to Golden Dome, we've actually already reported on that in Threat Status. It is and we actually got into it in our big Golden Dome for America event back in May, videos of which, by the way, are still on the Threat Status website for anybody who wants to go watch that. It is interesting, and I think you pointed this out, that this feels like it was an official presentation. So we're moving out of the speculation zone of what Golden Dome could actually look like and into what it seems that the Trump administration is saying it would look like. As to the issue of this gag order stuff, it's pretty interesting. We got into this, as you mentioned, in last week's episode What's wild, Vaughn, is I was at the 2025 Space and Missile Defense Symposium, and behind the scenes, defense officials are talking about Golden Dome, mostly with private contractors, but there is this messaging control going on from the Pentagon. Some of it has to do with security concerns and this idea that everything the U.S. is doing with advanced missile defense right now is being watched very closely by U.S. adversaries, particularly China and Russia. And there's real concern about giving the house away before it's built by talking too much about the specific details of it. With regard to space and missile defense more broadly, I do also want to highlight, Vaughn, that I sat down at last week's symposium in Huntsville for an exclusive video interview with Lieutenant General Sean Gainey, the commanding general of U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command and the Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense. We had a wide-ranging discussion on the Army's role as a mission leader and integrator across this sort of futuristic domain. The interview is pretty eye-opening, if I don't say so myself. I hope people will watch it on the Threat Status pages at the Washington Times. General Gainey opened up about a bunch of things that the Army is doing, Vaughn, but interestingly, he did not explicitly address Golden Dome, most likely because of this Pentagon order on top officials not to speak openly or use those terms. Shifting gears, I want to let listeners know that we're obviously tracking very closely the major summit between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin taking place on August 15 at U.S. Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage, Alaska. The catch here is that this episode of the podcast dropped in the morning, a few hours before the summit. So we're going to be tracking all of it and the aftermath and analysis throughout the coming days in the Threat Status newsletter. And I'll be offering actually my own take when we get to our Threat of the Week section later in the episode of the podcast. Before I just go on and on, Vaughn, is there anything else on your radar at the moment?
Well, speaking about Alaska, I did want to highlight further reporting that our colleague Mike Glenn was doing earlier this week regarding the Chinese icebreaker vessels spotted north of Alaska. Coast Guard officials said that they are currently monitoring two ships operating in the Bering and Chukchi Seas. The Coast Guard's Arctic District also dispatched a C-130 Hercules from Alaska's air station in Kodiak to investigate reports of a Chinese research vessel spotted less than 300 nautical miles off the north coast of Alaska. The tracking missions were reportedly part of Operation Frontier Sentinel, which is designed to quickly respond to reports of U.S. rivals operating around U.S. Arctic waters. Now, for China, the Arctic is crucially important geopolitically and stands to become even more central as experts project the Arctic Ocean to experience ice-free summers in the coming decades. In recent years, China has increased its presence in the region, with Coast Guard officials reporting this week's incident follows a 3-year trend of increased activity in Beijing's research vessels in the U.S. Arctic. The U.S. Arctic's fleet is also lacking compared to rivals in the region like Russia and China. Russia has far and away the biggest fleet of large icebreaker ships in the world, with dozens of vessels available for use. And while China has only deployed around 5 similar research vessels in the Arctic in recent years, it's more than the U.S.'s 2 operational ships. Still, as Glenn reports, the Coast Guard could see more icebreakers coming their way via Trump's Big Beautiful Bill. Service officials report that allocations from the bill could allow it to construct at least 17 large polar and non-polar capable icebreaker ships. That reporting has been really interesting, especially as we deal with security concerns in what is going to definitely be a very important waterway in the coming years.
Totally interesting, Vaughn. For me, this is more of a trend line that Chinese vessels are just becoming more present in the Arctic. And I think that's what the Coast Guard was getting at, as opposed to this is some tactic that is tied to a specific geopolitical development elsewhere in the range of portfolios of tension between the U.S. and China, U.S.-China trade talks, that somehow China would be doing something elsewhere to gain leverage in a different portfolio. I actually just think there are more Chinese ships. The U.S. is trying to catch up. and the U.S. Coast Guard is calling out what it sees as an increase in activity over months.
Interesting. Yeah, it's absolutely the case, and it's something that we've seen since Trump took office in January. This extreme focus around U.S. shipbuilding, possibly rebuilding dominance as China and Russia start to just reassert their dominance. And I think that you're right, probably. That it largely isn't a part of a broader strategy and is more about the presence of Chinese naval dominance in places like the South China Sea or in the North Arctic.
Great stuff, Vaughn. I'm pretty excited about the interview that we are going to hear with U.S. Army Special Forces Colonel Stu Bradin, the president and CEO of the Global SOF Foundation. We're going to go to that now. It was actually national security correspondent and regular Threat Status Weekly podcast host Ben Wolfgang who conducted the interview with Stu Bradin. They cover some pretty interesting ground.
And we are joined now by Stu Bradin, the president and CEO of the Global SOF Foundation. And listeners probably remember we had Stu on the show a few months ago ahead of the SOF Week event in Tampa, Florida, and we are thrilled to have him back. Stu is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel, more than 30 years of service all over the world, and the organization, the Global SOF Foundation, organizes SOF Week in Tampa and a number of other events, including one that we're going to talk about here in just a couple of minutes. Stu, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So let's talk about this right off the bat. Global SOF Foundation holding its Indo-Pacific Irregular Warfare Symposium in Bangkok, Thailand from August 19th through the 21st. Tell our listeners what this symposium is all about and why, from your perspective, it's important right now.
We do a great event in Europe every year. We've done 8 or 9 of them every year. And what we found is that there was a huge void and we needed to do something similar to that in the Indo-Pacific region. So we started last year in Hawaii. No background, just planned for 400 people, had about 600 people show up. So we said, okay, there's interest. We're doing it in Bangkok, Thailand, and the reason we picked Bangkok is it's one of the 5 treaty nations with the United States. It's really critical to Southeast Asia, and it's been with the U.S. in almost every war for the last 40 years, to include, they were the first Asian nation into Kandahar after 9/11. So, we have a lot going on there. The interesting thing is as the U.S. and the world look to the Indo-Pacific, what you're finding is it's almost impossible to have supply chain meet the demands with the distance. And so we're going to have our partners actually do manufacturing, especially of things of expendable durables. It's just you can't fly it and you can't long haul it. Even in a permissive environment, it takes forever. If someone's shooting at you, or you have to move in convoys or some other way than just getting on a container in LA and getting there, it changes the mathematics significantly. And so we've got to get our partners in that region. And that's kind of the theme, is to help the Thais build some basis of industrial strength. We've sold the event out. It's got over 650 people that are attending. We sold all the sponsorships and whatnot. So we're excited. Next year in 2026, we'll go back to Hawaii. And then in 27, we're going to be in Manila.
Well, Stu, I was going to bring this up later, but since you mentioned it, I'll ask now. On the distances in the Pacific, we had General Chris Mohan, the acting commander of U.S. Army Material Command, on the show a few weeks ago, and he went into detail about the challenges of moving materiel around the Pacific versus a theater like Europe or even the Middle East, just the vast distances, oceans we're talking about here. Drill down into that a little bit more about what that means for SOF. What is it about the physical space and those distances that make the SOF missions more challenging?
You got to look at warfare through a different lens, right? Everybody in DoD wants to talk about what used to be called phase 3. That's the major theater conflict, right? They skip phases 0, 1, and 2, the buildup leading up to the major thing. They just pretend those don't exist. And all your force structures built on phase 3, the big war. Then phase 4, when you hand over to civilian authorities, they're out. They don't, why would, they're just get on a plane and go home, right? So everybody in big, dumb, conventional military loves phase 3. That's the game, right? The warm-ups, the practices, they don't do that. But if you look at competition, it changes everything, right? Because it's a form of warfare that's not a major theater operation. And what you see in it is soft cyber intel, information, economic, and I would say coming up quickly as number 6 is lawfare. Right now, most people don't respect lawfare. Most nations don't, but some do. And at some point in time, it may have a larger impact than it currently does. But you're seeing a lot of that is what's happening in competition. And SOF has, it's no better organization in the world to be partnered with our allies in the region and stuff. And so you've got to take a lot of these CONUS-based special operations forces and you've got to project them forward in a more robust way than we currently do. We've got to get more of them out there.
I want to drill into this irregular warfare, of course, in the title, the Irregular Warfare Symposium, because, and we discussed this a couple of months ago when you were on the show, Stu, this idea that I think too many of Americans too often think about special forces only through the prism of counterterrorism operations, for the mission that killed bin Laden, for example. But irregular warfare, as you know better than anybody, is a central piece of what SOF does and has always done. So for listeners who might be questioning, well, what exactly does that mean? Can you walk us through what irregular warfare means from the perspective of someone in the special forces world? What kind of missions does that conjure up in your mind?
Well, it's evolved, but it's been around for a long, long time. People call it unconventional warfare, asymmetric, hybrid. You put whatever name or label you want on it. But irregular warfare is really anything that's not conventional warfare. And so a lot of the missions you're seeing you're looking at people that are using autonomous systems or non-attributable things. You're looking at people that are doing strategic operations. They're focused on things that will cripple you strategically. Economic, I mean, you know the deal. You can do a cyber attack on somebody's financial systems and you can create such a civil disturbance that there's riots in the streets. And we laugh, but you look at a country like China, the CCP's entire defense mechanism is focused on keeping their population restricted. And so when you do information operations and you are able to do cyber attacks and financial, operations against them, you can seriously disrupt the internal workings of a country and never fire a shot. You can bring them to civil war and never fire a shot.
Where are our ability following up on that? Where are we today in those operations versus our adversaries, particularly Russia and China? I'm fascinated by this question because I just wonder if we're at a disadvantage, we being the U.S. in some ways, because I think I may have mentioned this to you a couple of months ago when you were on the show that, we don't want to take down the banking system for the middle class in China or take down the water systems in a city in Russia somewhere just for the hell of it. Whereas we do face those kinds of attacks from our adversaries. So in terms of, sowing chaos or trying to grinding a society to a standstill, are we just kind of naturally at a disadvantage because we don't do the things that our adversaries are willing to do?
The rule of law matters to us. And so, yeah, we're at a huge disadvantage. The whole Western world is. If you believe in the rule of law, you're in trouble. But if you're a dictator, I mean, that's the best word I can come up with. And you're in charge and you answer only to you, then you can lie, cheat, and steal, and it doesn't matter. And so, I mean, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia all have the axis that's lined up against this all have that stuff. And so I think what you're going to see in the future, I think it's going to be quite interesting because a lot of times it's political decision. It's always a political decision, but what's going to happen when AI is able to do predictive analysis and you're with a 5% error rate, and they're going to be able to tell you what's about to happen. Does a politician act preemptively or do they wait? That's going to be some real challenges. I don't know the answer to that. I think we're going to struggle because our machines and our information systems are going to be so accurate in the future with predictive analysis that, we're going to have to make decisions preemptively. And frankly, we're not set up for that.
Do you think our adversaries thinking that way too? I mean, do you get the sense that inside Beijing or in Moscow, they're looking at that through the same lens?
100%, man. Read their doctrine. The Chinese don't use rhetoric. Like when they put it down and say it, it's happening. Like it's a done. Yeah. He says, I'm ready to go in 2027. Bet. He's ready to go in 2027. He's not ready. I mean, he's meeting a timeline that they have set. He is prepared to do whatever. He knows at that point in time he can physically do what he wants to do and accomplish what he thinks he wants to accomplish. Our response to all that, in my opinion, is too conventional. Look, the worst thing that they could have happen, I heard Mike Waltz ask this question one time to the Air Force Chief of Staff. He said, do you think the Chinese fear your bat bomber, your new bat bomber, or do they fear more a Uyghur uprising? And of course, the answer is a Uyghur uprising. I just think if we're serious about disrupting China, we should give them some internal things to think about and work on. They are oppressing 189 million Muslim Chinese in concentration camps, and you hear no one, and I mean no one on Capitol Hill jumping up and down for the rights of those human beings.
So what can you do? So, and I realize this can start to drift into classified territory pretty quickly, but to the extent you can talk about it, what kinds of operations are you talking about? Like, what could we be doing that we're not doing to maybe exploit some of those divisions inside China, or even just to get accurate information out there to people who don't have access to it right now?
There's thousands of, you got to have the courage to do the operations. There's risk in every intelligence operation. And when I say risk, I mean lives, and compromise. And, it happens. It's all part of the game, right? But you've got to be willing to let people fail. If everything is so exquisite, you don't put it in harm's way, what's the value? You know what I mean? And so you've got to let people go out there and do this. There's millions of dissidents all over the world that would gladly participate in these things.
Stu, you mentioned the importance of Thailand at the outset here, and obviously the event is all about allies and partnerships, and you and everyone else that I talk to in the SOF world always stresses that, the importance of partnerships and working with friends and allies all over the world. Explain to me and to listeners sort of what that means from the SOF point of view. I think people can probably wrap their heads around, okay, we want the U.S. military to be able to conduct, air or ground traditional operations alongside the French or the British if necessary, or the South Koreans, we can go on and on. But what does that look like from a special forces point of view? How do the special forces of the U.S., for example, work with the special forces of the Pacific allies? What does that actually look like?
So basically what we're doing is advising and assisting, and logistically supporting our partners and allies and stuff. You're not going to move the Third Corps out of Fort Hood, Texas, to Bangkok, and it takes 9 months if you're lucky. That's if no one shoots at you. And then when you get there, what the hell are you going to do? You got to sustain that monster. You're better off partnering with your allies, working with them to make them more capable, better. They're there. It's their country that's getting invaded. They're the center of the issue. What we tend to do is we tend to roll large military forces in there, because who doesn't love a good war? The defense industry loves it. Politicians love it. Everybody, ribbon probability index is high. So let's get in there and get another, become field marshals. And we do it to ourselves in every war. And we load these large conventional formations into an unconventional environment, and then we're stunned that we suck at it because we put the wrong players on the field. And what we should do is we should work with our partners. Don't take their war from them. Just make them better at what they're doing, enable them to fight. You don't need to, most of them are quite competent. They're very proud, and they'll fight for their own stuff. You just got to help them. And what you see in the special operations community is we're built to partner with these people and help train them and lead them and advise them so they do win.
I'm curious, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, Stu, but I'm just curious. What's the tension level like right now between folks like yourself and maybe, folks in the Army, for example, who may feel like we do need more money and more resources for more traditional ground-based forces, for example? Is there kind of a push and pull or a tug of war right now sort of behind the scenes in terms of which direction, broadly speaking, the U.S. military machine is going to go?
If you look at what the president just signed, $150 billion into the reconciliation bill, we're just buying more of the legacy stuff. These are all things that are deterrents. But if you had to really deploy the third corps, what are you going to do with it? Like, where is it going? It takes forever to get it on a ro-ro ship at Beaumont, Texas. It takes forever to get these ships through the Panama Canal into wherever the heck they're going. And once they get there, you've got to offload them, you've got to arm them, you've got to go to man camps and cantonment areas and put fuel. All this is in a permissive environment. I mean, who the hell is going to allow that? It's not going to be the Chinese. Their doctrine says they won't allow that. They'll strike. They'll use long-range precision stuff. And so, with the tension between the services, I mean, they have got to get lighter and more deployable. They also need to be able to execute. If you mass today, if you mass forces, I don't care what type it is, you will be destroyed. Like, you can't mass. And our whole organizational structures are built off mass formations. Just look in the Ukraine, look in Gaza. I mean, everybody goes, oh, the next war won't be fought like that. I agree. It'll be worse. But every time, all the sensors and things, and now when you start getting more technology and space-based operations in it, when your probability detection is 100%, you have no survivability, especially if you're wrapped in metal. Look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. They don't use tanks or BMPs. They got 2 to 3 people racing down a hedgerow like a bunch of chuckleheads with drones chasing them. Every time they take an armor formation and put it out there, they just annihilate it within minutes. Within minutes, it's gone. Most of the M1 tanks we gave the Ukrainians are gone. A lot of the Bradleys are gone. They're now hauling the Bradleys off to Poland to be, have depot level maintenance, see if they can patch them back up. But, I mean, those systems, the world is different with long range precision fires. It's changed everything. And now the sensors, the ability to detect things, autonomous systems to be able to, a 155 round goes 15 to 20 miles, whereas a FPV can go 25, 30 miles. It's just total, and it's a tenth of the cost. And so you're going to get to where the world is changing and our leadership is not. It still talks about, doing things faster and better. And, Admiral Olson used to always say, you are what you buy, man. And, look at what we're buying in reconciliation, just more legacy crap.
Well, Stu, speaking of money, we'll finish with this in the couple minutes we have left. And I don't want to put you in a position to try to tell other governments what to do, but obviously this president with some success has gotten allies, especially in Europe, to spend more on their defense. I'm curious where you think, particularly with allies in the Pacific that we're talking about here today, are they spending enough on special operations? Does that need to be part of this broader increase in defense spending among allies, or do you think that they've kind of gotten the message and are putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak?
Interesting. I think they're better off than we are, but they still have the same disease. The Germans love the Leopard 2, can't get enough of them, so they'll buy more of those. That's just the way it is. It also supports their defense industry, which has a huge lobbying effort in all of these nations as well. But they're closer to the Ukraine. They're seeing what the Ukraine's actually using to fight and win. A lot of them have advisors in the Ukraine that are doing lessons learned and watching the fight closely. They're learning. It's like, was it 1.3 trillion more in defense spending, the most they've spent in 40 years? I'm hoping that they're going for more autonomous stuff. We're seeing more and more desire to see that technology. Unfortunately, a lot of it's not as robust as, a lot of it's still experimental. But that's changing quickly. I think within 3 years, you're going to see fleets and large inventories of autonomous things that people will pick from. But I do give the Europeans, I mean, they have an edge, because the Ukraine has educated them. Same in Gaza, they roll in there with a bunch of Macavas, and the next thing those things are just getting smoked. So it's just different. I'm interested to see how the Israelis did their subsurface work. Which I think is amazing. They got crushed at first. They knew the tunnels were there. I don't think they realized they were extensive as they were, but they learned a lot. There's a lot of good lessons learned there. I think the Ukrainians on electronic warfare, my last visit to the Ukraine, electronic warfare, hands down, was the most impressive thing I've ever seen. You can show up with whatever UAV, anything you have. Within 14 days, it doesn't work. I don't care what voodoo technology you have in there, their engineers are forward and they will come up with countermeasures. And so it's a true war of engineering at its finest. I call it the nerd wars. They're getting it on. I mean, they're up front. They're not calling back to some lab, 2,000 miles away. You are engineering and innovating at the front, and it's really cool, and these are dedicated people. I mean, I remember when the Ukrainians couldn't get enough 155 rounds. They still would like to have them, but I can guarantee you they'll take FPVs over 155 rounds any day of the week.
Stu Bradin, the Global SOF Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where we identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week. Vaughn, this is the first time you've done this on the podcast. Take it away. What is your threat of the week?
My threat of the week is the deployment of 2 U.S. warships on Wednesday in response to a collision between 2 Chinese ships in the South China Sea earlier this week. A Chinese naval destroyer and a Chinese Coast Guard ship reportedly collided after trying to drive away a smaller Philippine Coast Guard ship from the Scarborough Shoal, a lucrative fishing location claimed by both the Philippines and China. Since this is a developing situation, there are still things we don't know, but China's intimidation of the Philippine Navy and the U.S.'s response does raise serious security concerns for the future of those contested waters.
Big story there. We're all over it. I think we've had it almost every day the past few weeks. And we also have Washington Times Asia editor Andy Salmon, who has been writing about the U.S.-Philippine alliance and just how all of this is playing out, South China Sea, disputed territory, and all this Chinese military muscle flexing. Let me get to my threat of the week, which focuses on the Trump-Putin summit and the prospect that Vladimir Putin will use the summit as a foil or a distraction to engage in unforeseen tactics elsewhere in the world aimed at using pro-Russian propaganda to undermine U.S. influence over the international community. I believe that President Trump's intentions are in the right place here. You may be a listener who is a supporter of Mr. Trump. You may be a listener that dislikes the president or opposes his every move. You may be neutral, but I believe he wants to end the Ukraine war and is determined to get that to happen. And frankly, it needs to happen. Of course, there are concerns that Putin will seek to exploit the situation to hold territory that the Russian military has violently seized in its invasion of Ukraine. There are also concerns that the summit could backfire. It could lead to an expanded war. But my threat of the week is that Putin will actually use the hype of this summit to advance his own image on the world stage as a powerful leader. And he may engage in unforeseen tactics in other geopolitical arenas, such as the Middle East and Africa, to undermine U.S. influence in those places. So with that, we are at the end of this week's episode. A huge thanks to Army Special Forces Colonel Stu Bradin for his insightful interview. Thanks to Vaughn Cockayne for contributing to the show this week. And a big thanks to all of you, of course, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends. Ben Wolfgang and I will be back for next week's episode on the Threat Status Podcast.